mes šiandien veiksim taip, kad bus ir diskusijų, ir pranešimų, ir diskusijų bus net vienu metu keliose skirtingose erdvėse. Tai apie visą tai papasakosiu ir tikrai pasakysiu, bet dabar jau keliausim prie pirmo pranešimo, tokios keynote speech. Bus galimybė užduoti klausimą. Aš tikiu, kad kažkada pasirodys QR kodas, kurį nuskanavę štai. Štai jis. Užduokit, kas jums rūpi ir kas jums svarbu, kaip nors prisidedant, kad šita diskusija būtų kuo, bet kuri diskusija po pranešėjų būtų kuo instrumentalesnė. Ir kitas pranešėjas bus tikrai žinomas miesto plėtros ir inovacijų ekspertas, kuris yra žinomas kaip knygų Kūrybinis miestas, įrankių rinkinys miesto novatoriams ir miesto kūrimo menas autorius. Žinau, kad kažkuria iš knygų bus irgi galima įsigyti, tai pasinaudokit galimybę su parašu ją gauti. QR kodas pasakiau, belieka tik įvardyt ir labai šiltai jį pakviesti. Kūrybiniai miestai vakar, šiandien ir rytoj. The Creative City, Past, Present and Future. Charles Landry is with us. Let's welcome him.
Clicker, 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 clicker. This slide is a slide of an exhibition in Sicily, and it was crazy because we drove around in this truck saying, politicians, what is a creative city? What did we say? Poor people, what is a creative city? Policemen, what is a creative city? Everybody thought I was crazy, but that doesn't matter because this was quite amusing. Anyway, I do want to talk about this, and the Creative City agenda, of course, this is not the first time people in the world have ever talked about that. And one of the things I quite like as an expression is this one here. A city is more than a place in space, it's a drama in time. And the man said this, he was a biologist, one of the first urban planners, Patrick Geddes, 130 years ago. And that I think is true, because when you wander around cities, you feel that drama all the time. And another sentence I really like is, the city is the laboratory for solving the problems of its own making, because the city creates problems that are related to the city, and a creative city obviously has to solve those. So it's a laboratory, not this sort of scientific laboratory, but it's a laboratory in public space, in the organization and the management of the city as a whole. The essence of the Creative City, a fat book in one sentence, is in times of dramatic change, how do you create the conditions for people, organizations, and the city as a whole to solve problems and create opportunities? Now, indeed, there always have been creative cities. This happens to be Siena, and those people who've been to Siena will know that it's an extremely interesting place. But they invented many things that we use today, whereas Birute, they invented accounting and how financial systems work, just as an example, apart from being interesting artistically. But the novelty over the last 30 years or so, 40 years, is how do you self-consciously become a creative city, where you say, this is a resource, creativity, and then to weave these elements of different sectors and different types of creativity into some sort of mosaic that hangs together. Because we all know that there are individual creative projects everywhere in the world, but in a city, how do you bring them together? And another metaphor I often use, and I thought about this a while ago, because lots of you are into music, is a creative city is more like jazz, rather than an improvised jazz, of course, rather than a well-tempered symphony performance. Because a symphony performance, everything is sort of organized and so on. But a city, so many unexpected things for good and for bad happened. So jazz, I think, is a great metaphor for the creative city. So if we think of then, the past, and now, and then the future, let's look at what our resources are. We know, in this audience, we know, and the main point is, what about the skeptics? I'm always interested in the skeptics, the people who don't believe what you do. But anyway, in this audience, we all know that creativity is who we are, and that culture is who we are, and creativity helps us what we can become. So these things together are really important. But I saw this graffiti some while ago, and it says, culture is not our operating system. Sometimes people say it's, you know what they say, it's the decoration at the end of the day and all of that. But really what it is, the other invisible hand, that hand that guides everything, it's everywhere. And if you were trying to think it through, this big word culture, you would see and ask yourself, or I ask myself, why is it not taken seriously enough in city development? It's absolutely, in a sense, crazy, because it's so obvious to me. Because, of course, culture is the air we breathe, and it is our second skin, and, of course, it's all to do with identity and so on. So culture matters in all sorts of ways. It's the process of making sense. Culture, I think, helps us make sense and create understanding. But even more importantly, it is the meaning-making machine, the machine that creates things that are significant to us. So this question of understanding and what is significant are the two most powerful things for me that culture is about. Just focusing for a moment on artistic imagination, because of course there are many forms of creativity, social creativity, academic creativity, business creativity, and so on, is, I think, and the interesting point for me at least, you may agree, you may disagree, that it can help clarify or challenge those things that are clear, those things that are complicated, those things that are complex, those things that are chaotic, and those things that are confused. Perhaps not the confused, but a lot of those things it can help clarify. And the whole idea of the culturally driven creative city is trying to make a very big connection. A connection between what I've already discussed, culture, creativity, and the city. And in a way, helping us ask ourselves, is there an answer in this for our cities? But what I do think it tries to do, it helps us trying to navigate the changes. In my experience, those people who really take culture seriously, they have navigated the future of their cities far, far better than those who pretend it's not important. I mean, just think of the cities. I mean, I've had an incredibly long involvement with Helsinki for 30 years, and people used to think, oh my God, it's dark in November, the snow, blah, 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 blah. But in fact, their rise and relative success is a lot to do with that, as is for many other cities. So how do they do that? They clearly do it in a way where they allow a situation where people are allowed to use their imagination. Now, what are the key qualities? There are many qualities, we know that. The first one is being open-minded rather than closed-minded. The second is one of our slogans for a festival I run called the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. I know that sounds strange. And our slogan is, how do you move from a no because culture to a yes if culture? And how do you balance that process of thinking widely and then knowing when to focus? So it's not all 24/7, oh, I'm so creative, isn't it wonderful, ba 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 ba, and let's dance. Sometimes it's, what do I need to focus on and how do I make something happen? So this cycle of creativity starts with something, and I only realized that late in the day, it's curiosity. Unless you have a place that allows you to be curious and legitimizes curiosity, only then might you, as an individual perhaps, become imaginative. And if we're imaginative, we might have some ideas, we might have an open mind, and then we might be creative. And out of those 10 creative ideas, 8 might be rubbish. But nevertheless, there are 2 that might lead to an invention, and from that an innovation, which then ideally leads to curiosity again. And so for me, this cycle is incredibly important, starting with curiosity. So a guiding principle for me, at least, is always taking the glass half full approach. We know the situation is absolutely dreadful. We know that, but having a glass half full at least means that we might say, what can we achieve within this? And how can we turn a weakness into a strength? So if I'm working with places, we're always asking that question. What is your weakness? How can you turn it into a strength? How can you do that? Another guiding principle is a continual interplay between culture in a big way, the meaning of life way, and culture in the narrow way, let's say the art forms, the disciplines of the creative economy and so on. So I would always ask the question, what is the role of those disciplines within the creative economy or somewhere else in helping that bigger transformation itself? And that bigger manifestation itself is perhaps a cultural project. And a major manifestation, and I think we can prove through so many examples, that these cultural forms that you represent are really absolutely one of the engines of what makes places work. Now, words do matter. Now, I don't know Lithuanian, unfortunately, but I have made Milda speak a bit of, and Ruta speak a bit of Lithuanian to me, so I could somehow feel it. Anyway, in English, there's a difference between cultural planning and planning culturally. So the whole movement started 30, 40 years ago. People used to say, we've got to do cultural planning. And people then think, oh, we've got to build this lovely building, we've got to build an opera house, and so on. But planning culturally is different. It's saying, I'm understanding how I plan, and I discussed with your chief architect this yesterday, that actually if you plan culturally, the way you do and build the city is very different because you're aware of where this place comes from, what is relevant, and et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, city making is a cultural project because it's about the values. The values. When you walk around Vilnius or Lviv, for example, Bogdana, you immediately understand, why this place, or not quite immediately, but after a bit of thought, you understand why this place was built as it was. Some places have buildings that say no. Hey, who's that saying no with the building? Other buildings say yes. What sort of person is that? Libraries traditionally tend to be buildings that say yes. They're inviting you in all the time and so on. So basically, what I mean by city making as a cultural project is because it's about behaviors, mindset, values, and so on. And it obviously responds to the circumstances. A port city next to the sea, Shanghai, is different from Beijing. A city on the top of a mountain is probably more enclosed than one on the flat lands and so on. And obviously weather, etc., etc. Now, all of this, in theory, I think it is a shift in paradigm. And the idea of what you have as your topic here, creativity, cities in the spotlight, etc., is really, for me, an empowering ethos. It has an empowering ethos. It's about enabling potential. It's about letting ordinary people, perhaps, and we can see that when we allow them to express themselves, make the extraordinary happen if given a chance. But there is a bigger story. And this bigger story is a story I think is true for Kaunas, Vilnius, Klaipėda, lots of places outside of Lithuania as well. And this bigger story is a story of a culture of creativity. And therefore, it's also about the creativity of bureaucrats. I haven't really been a bureaucrat, but I quite like bureaucrats. I don't know why. And because they also have something to offer the world. They're not all, strange people. Because we can have social creativity, business creativity, all of the words there. And I run a festival in Berlin where quite a lot of people come, and they come from 45 countries, just describing the creative bureaucracy, essentially, what they are doing to reinvent the way things work. And that, of course, requires this open-minded attitude. So you can measure creativity in the city, I believe, at least, and the way I happen to do it, but you might do it completely different, is to assess, is there a nurturing attitude? Is it easy to develop your talents? Are things participative, accessible? Can I, even if I'm poor, reach the highest levels of whatever? So that's one condition. The second is enabling and supporting. This is where the administration, the national, local, all of these governments come in. Are the rules and incentives, or more, the incentives and rules, ones that encourage that? Are they flexible, agile? Thirdly, one then would ask, how is this harnessed? Is the networking strong? Are we bringing the forces together? This is an example. Obviously, your network is an example of enabling and harnessing creativity. This event is an example of it, and then exploiting it. But one of the main things in the end, if it's all hidden in rooms, in dark rooms, who knows about it? So therefore, the public space is the canvas, the stage, the setting has to be one that when I'm walking around Vilnius, I get the feeling, hey, etc., etc. You know what I'm talking about. And in a sense, one city which is very good at this is Mannheim in Germany. And the only reason I'm showing that is they, as a city, really punch above their weight. And this is their annual meeting. And if you just look at these words, and of course you will understand German, you can see it's connecting Wirtschaft, economy, with innovation systems, with Wissenschaft, you know, science, culture, blah, 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 architecture. You can see the words. And very few cities actually do that because, as we know, too many operate in silos. Now, in this whole development of the creative city, what became clear is that cities needed a plan B. We're talking of, a few decades ago. And what was happening, at least in, Western Europe, probably also here, I don't know exactly, everything was going down. People were leaving their cities. Glasgow, over 30 years, lost 300,000 people. Liverpool, the same amount of people just left the city because they couldn't do anything. So the question cities ask themselves, how can I get them to come back? And then one of the resources was precisely what we're talking about today. And that was indeed the initial focus. When I wrote the first things, I don't know, it was too long ago, I'm sorry about this, but oh my God. Am I old? Yes-ish. Anyway, initially we focused on arts and culture and all the direct and indirect effects which you know about, and I'm not going to list all of these things, but also the symbolic effects. And symbols are absolutely key because symbols sort of drive emotions and so on. So that was the initial focus. And what people saw, that if you looked at that closely, everything's going down, but all of these sectors that you represent, let's call them the creative economy, the cultural industries, whatever you like, when you add the elements together, they're so much bigger than you ever thought. A turning point in Britain, just to give you one fact, was when they realized that the exports of the motor industry were less than the exports of the music industry in Britain. So at that point, a few people, not enough, of course, realized there's something going on here, and you know all the statistics, so I won't go into that. But the key point is seeing them together. If you just look at the way a record might be produced or a theatre performance, the actual industries that are involved in that are obviously combining many of them, including probably dance, like all of those folks, wherever they are. So that's seeing it together was a key breakthrough. So the next question we then asked, many people as well, then, where next and how at that moment? What is the new wave of creativity, which was, of course, different from Siena in the past, but every period has its own form, of course, and seeing basically a problem as an opportunity. And I remember seeing this building in Katowice, And it was one of our classics. We all know what will happen in this building if done well. And what I find so interesting, perhaps amusing, is that precisely the places which were so dreadful to work in, this is an irony, are then the places of being hip. Okay, we'll leave that for the moment. But I think one of the reasons is, of course, the patina of ages that you can see in the walls when you don't make it too perfect. You feel you can be a maker, shaper, co-creator of this evolving place. But here's another example, which is where I had this exhibition, the first slide. It's called Farm Cultural Park in Favara. Now, typically Italian cities, as you know, they're on a hill, defense. We've all got cars, they leave all the houses and go somewhere else and build horrible cities. We think Italian cities are all wonderful, but actually if you look at the new bits, they're just as horrible as everywhere else. But the older bits often are fantastic. So a lawyer, 2 lawyers and his wife, Andrea Bartoli, and his wife, Silvana, they together started buying up these buildings for 5,000 euros, 3,000 euros. Anyway, 15 years later, this place is booming from 5 tourists, or 8, or 15, or 20. There are 120,000. Anyway, you can imagine the hotel industry, etc., develops. But it was basically just allowing things to happen. And one of their main events, this small place, Favara, F-A-V-A-R-A, actually has a Biennale of cities. And I think Vilnius should be part of the next Biennale of cities, which is amazing, isn't it? Chicago is represented, and why not Vilnius as well? But then you know the other examples, all these examples, you know, Capelli in Helsinki or Manufactura in Łódź and so on. These are all well known. Okay, the Łódź one, Manufactura is a classic. Let's have a shopping centre, a leisure centre, a fitness centre. Okay, it's fine, but could there be something else as well? And this leads me to my little tour with Milda yesterday. I said, Milda, we have got to have a walk in Vilnius, because the last time I was here was 25 years ago, and I have forgotten nearly everything. So we then walk down and we see this, and okay, what I felt, it's very small, but lots of little small things. There are 250 of these pieces in that Literatur Street, make a big thing. And what's interesting, it was a collaboration between an art museum and the literature sector. That's interesting, because we all know we need to collaborate. And then, of course, I saw on the web and I said, I've got to go to Užupis. I must go there. I must see this republic, because where I come from is possibly the most alternative place in Britain. You won't have heard about it. Stroud, S-T-R-O-U-D, which also has cups. My cup says the Republic of Stroud. So I felt very at home when I saw that. And I felt particularly at home when I saw the Constitution. And the thing I like best in the Constitution, when it says a dog has the right to be a dog. And then a cat is not obliged to love its owner, but must be kind when it is in need. My God, I love that. Everyone has the right not to, do its obligations. I love that I don't need to be obliged to stand here like this and can move around. I love it. Everyone has the right to be silent. My God. I mean, if we really took this seriously, this city would be rather interesting. And then, of course, what's his name? Jonas Mekas. I thought, hey, Fluxus. Hey, Vilnius is quite cool. Fluxus, I thought, was only in Germany. I didn't realize the Lithuanians were relatively cool. Sorry, I do know that. In the meantime, of course I know that. And then I saw this Mikole picture thing, and I said, oh, that's quite interesting. And then suddenly I walk around the corner and there she is and say, come up to my studio. And I think what she does is good. And then this was quite interesting, this sign, no meaning of life, try changing your values. Why not? No meaning in life, why don't you change your partner or workplace? No meaning in life, why don't you turn off your social media? Brilliant. Anyway, sorry, I'm just saying the symbols of a city. That's what I mean by it expressing itself. The city
is, through every fiber of its being, not necessarily signs like this, talking to us. As we walk down the street, what we see, the city is really talking to us in words and non-words. And of course, you all know that the Jewish heritage has sort of disappeared, and I think this is great that there's some memory there. But what I did love is this sign. You know it, yeah, I know you all know it. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And I love the fact that boom, 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 boom. Anyway, you get the idea. And thinking afresh is, of course, incredibly difficult. Although I'm saying, let's think afresh. You talk to my kids, they say, you're a bit of a boring old fart. You seem to be saying the same things all the time. Anyway, on we go on this tour. And we passed the Museum of Genocide, and I realized facts that I didn't really want to know because they're so horrific. Anyway, but it's important. And then we come down, and when I saw the prison, I said, I've got to meet these guys. And who are this? Okay, Paulas and Martinez. I hope you're bloody here somewhere. Anyway, so we saw these guys, had a conversation. You know all of this. What I'm telling you now is what you know. The only thing I'm trying to say about this is that we need spaces of experimentation and so on, because we know what a certain logic of city making is. I know it, you know it, everybody knows it. And that is to build skyscrapers precisely in this point. Yeah? We know that. But that's because there's a very narrow definition of capital. This very narrow definition of capital says the only way you can measure capital is through financial figures, rather than what is the cost of social capital if you tear this down? What is the cost of losing the heritage capital? What is the cost of all these other capitals you lose? And if you add the capitals together, if you tear this building down and build skyscrapers, that made a loss in terms of capital. And this is very, of course, difficult to persuade some people. But of course, in their private life, those same people who say tear the building down, they want to come here, yeah? I have seen in Berlin so many events where these sort of people say, oh, let me in, I want to be cool for 5 minutes, and then they want to be ordinary later again. You know the story. But anyway, going into the prison, and I'm not telling you things you don't know, this is where they meet the prisoners and the so-and-so. This, I believe, is the Catholic Church, and my God, they hardly did anything, the two guys. And then going in further, my God. And then I saw Ruta's lovely exhibition. By the way, I also went to your office, this other Ruta. I hope not everybody's called Ruta, but the other Ruta from the creative, UNESCO Creative City. We went there, but I'm sorry I didn't take a picture. Anyway, here we are. But this exhibition was so simple. You can see what it's called, In the Shoes of Lithuanian Partisans. And this was all about shoes, and the message is in shoes. And I just thought, anyway, I just thought it was brilliant in its simplicity. And then we saw, obviously, a sexist cell, etc. Anyway, enough of that. I'm just trying to say I was in Lithuania yesterday. I was in Vilnius. I did walk around. I did have a conversation with some people, etc. Anyway, what all of this is about is breaking down the old divides between high art, low art, high culture, low culture, funded and commercial, basically not seeing these sharp divisions, and also where culture is seen and where it happens. It's not always. Obviously, this building is great, but it can happen in lots of other places. And this reminds me there are probably, I don't know, let's call it culture 1.0. That's the sort of repertoire we know. We have an opera house, we have a museum, we have all of these institutions, which historically were always closed when I'm free after work. But anyway, that's a different story. That's changing because today is museums night. I better get to some of those museums. Then we have what you might call culture 2.0, which is, I think, what your association and others represents, which we've talked about already, which is powerful. But then the next phase, you could say, is culture 3.0, which is much more stay ahead of the culture by producing your own culture, which, of course, the platforms we have and so on. I could say culture 4.0, you know, digitized, etc. But basically, the city and the culture, which is 3.0, has a completely different feel from that traditional type of city. And it operates differently. And that is in itself also important. So the value of the arts, I think we can say, it harnesses our critical capacities. And also, I think we should embed that thinking into all disciplines. So, whatever I'm calling you all artists for the day, who produce art. I could also say you produce products, but I'm not saying that. And what I think we should do is normalizing the presence of creatives like yourself in rethinking planning, health services, social services. I mean, when you get a designer to go into a municipality and look at all the processes, interesting things can happen. If you bring an actor in, interesting things can happen too. Not just fun, but solving problems. It's all about solving problems. And I don't think that is instrumentalizing. And I think what this does, it gives a certain sort of energy to this process. Now, if we turned all of this around, because I think a couple of policymakers are in here, everything begins with the letter E, at least in English, E, yeah? In English, the best cultural policy begins with E, and it is enlightenment, perhaps. It's empowerment, perhaps. It's entertainment, perhaps. It's, I'm still getting E, employability. It makes us more employable. There have been so many projects I know of where someone has had cultural drama training. They're not going into drama, but they're certainly better at doing another job, and that has been proven, the evidence of that. So that training is not useless. It has done other things in effect. So we know it has effects, and we know it can generate help, empathy, and dialogue, leaving aside that it gives perhaps colour to life. And here we have the big discussion. I don't know, not today probably, but in other contexts. And I think this distinction between the intrinsic value of what you do, where you don't care about what it is, you're just trying, experimenting and see what happens, versus the instrumental, I am helping well-being, I am helping urban regeneration, I am helping climate change or stuff like that. There is, let's not forget that. And then there's obviously the importance of having an institution, a sort of memory bank. But the question here is, there are other things to explore. And I think one can go somewhere else, or there are further connections to be made. And there's vast research, and the thing I'm particularly interested in, and I have been for a while, is the link between arts and science. And the science, people who are scientists who get involved in arts are more effective. And I'll give you a statistic here. Nobel Prize winners who are actually involved in art do things, perform a bit, play music, sing, whatever. They're nearly three times more likely to get the Nobel Prize. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Now, okay, interesting point to me. So this transdisciplinary stuff brings the whole brain together. That's really what the research shows. And it's so difficult, I know this might sound a bit abstract, but bringing the whole brain together is rather difficult. And as we all know, Max Planck, one of the most famous scientists in the world, said, a pioneering scientist must have an artistically creative mind. I know he said that a long time ago, but I think it's as relevant today as ever. So, as we know, science and theory moves towards proof. Perhaps arts and culture moves towards possibilities, and perhaps tech moves towards trying to make it happen. I'm simplifying, obviously. So a few more points about the future. What's the future, and what's all this stuff that you do? And I hope I can feel the passion in your eyes. I can't see all of you, but I can feel it in some of you. The future, the big issue, is there are many big issues, but one of them, one of my favorite words, yearning. Tell me later, Milda, what yearning is in Lithuanian. Yearning, yearning, desire, wanting something. There is a yearning to have a different sort of place, having a view of our city where there's a different sort of story, this story of where people are working together and they're saying to themselves, I'm not going to be the most creative city in the world, Vilnius. I'm going to be the best city for the world. The difference between in and for is dramatic. The one is slightly egocentric. The other is saying everything I do is for a bigger picture. And this exhibition in Australia even had it there, beyond the self, beyond the self. So that means refocusing creativity, addressing the bigger issues of our time, and seeing these multiple roles that you represent in this room. And what it's partly do, I don't know how to express it, I've called it detachment, but we need to unlearn many things. We need to unlearn the worst of capitalism, is just one example. We need to unlearn. We need to somehow, all these splits between our mind, body, we need to unlearn that. And of course, us and the natural world. We all know that nature heals and so on. So this wake-up call is really important. And what it reminds us of is everything is very fragile. The whole way the world is going is very fragile. And in many senses, you could say it's 1 minute towards midnight. And I remember, and you've seen it and you know it, Olafur Eliasson's, icebergs from Greenland, which was in Copenhagen and Paris, etc., viscerally made you realize. You didn't need a long explanation, because there's a difference between iconic communication and narrative communication. An academic has narrative communication. It goes like this. It doesn't even go like that. It goes, anyway, nevertheless, the best does go. However, iconic communication, you grasp it in one. And then later you understand. And that's more powerful. So this is where artistic thinking comes in. So this was the Ocean Marine Maritime Conference in London to get the new agreements. Now, I find that fish frightening, but very, very powerful. Or here in Dubai at the expo, this is the New Zealand room where you probably know that rivers have a legal right, and you are in the river. Now, feeling this is obviously a digital artwork, but to do that, my God, the complexity. So what we're really talking about in so much of what I'm saying is reducing our footprint, our bad footprint, and I'm only focusing on climate for a moment, and realizing that we do know that there are other ways of powering our cars. I suppose we're talking about the end of fossil fuels because we want to breathe more, because as we know, the earth hurts. So metaphors matter. The metaphor that I'm talking about, of course, is the city a machine or is it an organism? But of course it's an organism because it's made up of people and lots of other things. And I realized the other day that if we think of city making like being a gardener, it has all the attributes that we want, because when you're gardening, you have to think short, medium, long. How will the shade go? Is this plant right for summer, winter, autumn? There's all this stuff going on in the head of a gardener, which is exactly the thinking that urban planners and all of those people, I think, should adopt. Because it's also regenerative. It's always thinking, where will the plant come up again? Anyway, it would condition how you think, plan, and act. So there are endless parallels between things like gardenings and cities. Like these words, incubation. I bet you've all in some incubator center, or you're seeding, you're doing all of these words are basically gardening words that the new startup world is using. We're a hatchery. There's a place in Tallinn just about to be built in Krulli called the Hatchery. You get the idea. So here reminds me, and I'm going to finish pretty soon, is Brian Eno, who you know, wonderful artist, said, artists are to cities as worms are to the soil. I think it's brilliant. I think that's brilliant. No, but I wish I had invented that. I would have just said, yes! No, sorry, I would have said it quietly. Anyway, so what makes a livable place? And I'm just going to finish here on a series of things. A great, livable, creative, resilient, culturally vibrant places are places of anchorage and distinctiveness, heritage, but also what is specific. This is Jodhpur, this is Fez, this is Istanbul. Doesn't matter, it is about those places. They are places of blending the old and the new. This is the famous Tacheles building in Berlin, taken over by a Swedish fund. The champagne and graffiti, interesting combination. And then they built this. My God, you know, it didn't really blend the old and the new. The next one is nourishment and nurture. Somehow the food system, the way food is produced, and the facilities like hospitals and nurses, and all of this is part of that great livable, creative city. Places of affordability. The more popular Vilnius become, the less affordable it will be. We know that dilemma. Another story, another time. And this is where Singapore is great, the way it's found ways of having affordable housing through the age range. The next is really, obviously, to be able to communicate. But that can be in the physical structure. You know, this is obviously at the end of Paris, what's it called? La Défense. You know, even that physical space allows you to communicate. Or, you know, the millennium, the cloud gate in Chicago, where there's all this reflective thing and there are always people communicating, but also critical thinking. You need, I think, places which allows public discussions. This is from Linz, from Arts Electronica, the critical thinking zone. Or then it needs to be obviously diverse in the biggest sense of diversity, so you can be roughly who you are and want to be and express yourself. And of course, ambition and opportunity needs to be there somehow, these enabling things I discussed before. And then it needs to be a place of addressing the big issues of our time, and we know them. This is Venice. Of course, you've seen images like this before. So addressing the big issues, there is a focus for creativity. It's not just creative, I just want to be creative, 24/7. No, it has to have a purpose. And this aspiration, I think, is brilliant. When I first went into the Campi, you know, this place which is next to the bus station in Helsinki, I thought, my God, is silence beautiful? The sound of silence, oh my God. Anyway, but that is a place of aspiration, I think, as indeed can be a museum. I mean, I'm not talking about the Genocide Museum, but this is a version in Cape Town where people were thrown out of a whole area, and they, in a Baptist church, redrew the map, and people who'd been forced out put their name on these streets. So there can be all sorts of ways of inspiration and aspiration. And then I do think we need fun. I mean, Banksy is brilliant. I mean, he took Bristol Museum, which nobody goes to, and subverted about 100 images and things. So here the lion tamer has a problem, I think we could say. And here he just took a statue and made it look a bit like a criticism of consumption. And then I saw this the other day, and could you wake me up when I'm famous? I think it's brilliant. Wake me up when I'm famous, when you see that on the street. Anyway, what I'm saying, we do need fun. And then we obviously need to be digitally savvy in a way that we are controlling the information rather than it controlling us. And we obviously know the plus and minus of robotics and AI and so on. I heard your speech translated with ChatGPT. It was great. Anyway, but also we need to bend the market to bigger picture purposes. We want the energy, but we also want the values, these bigger values. So that, I think, is important too. And finally, we need places that have good governance and flexible government and so on. And this is where this Creative Bureaucracy Festival is just my version of it. But that requires rethinking rules and regulation. This is an artwork, by the way. And it's quite interesting, just how do we think about regulations and incentives for the future? And I believe this idea is a movement in the making. There are lots of people who come to it. I hope it continues. And then my final point is for many, 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 many years, I've been asked, what is the value of creativity and culture? and I've said a version of, leave me alone. I don't want to answer that question ever again. I've done so many studies. I hate it. It's boring. But I still think some of us, we do need to do it, provide the evidence in new ways. Because the big question is, what is the cost of not valuing them? So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Do you stay with us for a couple of minutes, if you don't mind, back on stage? We've got questions, and we've got a couple of minutes, not that much. Thank you so much for your presentation, your enthusiasm, and also for the photos of Vilnius, because they reminded us what we've got in our city, and I think that was a good encouragement for us to also stroll around. But what I wanted to ask you was this. When you say that culture is not taken seriously enough in city development, you've shown us some good examples of, places that do, but is there one city in the world that you would have visited or would have wanted to visit that does actually have that differently, that it takes culture seriously enough?
Yeah, there's an interesting connection between places that are threatened by some other thing. So Catalan culture, Barcelona, threatened, we could say, Catalonia by, Castilla. Montreal in Canada, Quebec versus so-and-so. So whenever you have Bilbao, Basque country versus Spain, and whenever, particularly those cities that are in those places where a bigger force, a bigger thing is threatening them, they really take it seriously, if we're just simplifying. So you could say those three places, Montreal, Barcelona and Bilbao. But then, of course, there are places like Amsterdam. I know the problem of over-tourism and so on. But there are places like that really, for example, they 25 years ago already had a breeding ground Brutplatzen strategy, which basically meant they knew that all these buildings we're talking about are under threat. They protected them in advance because they already knew that what will happen is a property developer will try and take it down, because they realized you needed areas of also experimentation, but also areas that, keep memory. I mean, memory is not a bad thing. Having a memory. Yeah. So those are just a couple of examples.
Thank you. There is a question from the audience that I think has got a built-in answer to it, but I'm going to read out the question and see how you will respond. Do you think to be in Vilnius is to be in Lithuania?
How can I answer that question?
How could you
One
know,
thing
right?
I do know, coming to Vilnius is different from going to Riga. So I do definitely know there's a difference between Latvia and Estonia as well, and Vilnius. Do I think I'm... Look, obviously I've been talking to people and asking how many people speak Lithuanian, what's the population, da-di-da-di-da. I've been asking all these questions, so I think it's also embedded. But then, of course, I met someone from Kaunas who said, there's also Kaunas, don't forget Kaunas. So, yeah, yes and no.
There is Kaunas, but I think
Klaipėda.
There is Klaipėda too. You don't have to know all of them, but I think what the question was about is that Vilnius is very different from the rest of Lithuania. And when we think about the capital city, we often forget the regions. We have that problem everywhere.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, okay, I'm being a bit too flip. You're a bit so serious. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not going to be serious. Okay,
you are serious. Don't be worried. That's fine. That's your role, to be serious. Now, obviously, a capital city always has a different, slightly different attitudes. I mean, look, the cliche of capital cities is they're arrogant. They think everything happens here. They're more important than anyone else, and everything else is boring. That's the cliche.
Now, kind of true.
Yes, it's kind of true. And the point is, in the new world, we know that cities, rural areas, regions, and all of that connect. I mean, particularly after COVID, the way places work is slightly different because you might need to be in Vilnius. Are you from Vilnius?
I am actually.
Okay. You know, the way someone might say, I'm in Vilnius for 2 days, 3 days, but also be somewhere else and so on. So, yeah, I think okay. Let's get beyond the cliche, ideally.
I'm going to ask a very serious question, but it wasn't mine, it was from the audience. What are the 3 correct questions to always ask when creating a new cultural policy in the city? 3 correct questions. I think 2 would do, or maybe even 1 if you don't want to bother yourself.
No. I'm still energetic.
Okay. Okay, so 3 then.
I had a slide which said energy. Look, I mean, one of the things, who are we addressing is one of the key questions. Who is this for would be the first question. And then my second question is, who is this for? What are our resources, which are obviously people and so on, but what are the other resources? So there might be historical resources, for example, and one might say, look, we don't want to get into nostalgia, but how can we reinvent historical resources or something just to spark the mind and so on? So those are 2 important questions for me.
And one last question for me, which would not be that serious, probably, because you said you kind of still liked the bureaucrats, which you criticized too. Why haven't you tried to become one in order to experience the other side of the story?
When I was very young, my first job was at the EU.
Oh,
okay.
That explains
So I
everything.
was there for 2 years as a sort of like assistant of an ex-government minister. So I was sort of inside, outside, but I got the idea. But the project I was involved in this many, many years ago was the future of Europe 30 years ahead. It's because everything, my work, also what I studied in my master's was always about what's the next step. So the second thing, again, this is not really the real experience, I worked for the World Bank for 1 year in Washington. And what can I say? You know, I didn't stay long. But anyway, the point is I have worked with public administrators for really a very long time, and I know that many of them are really good people because they're interested, in theory, the best, in the public interest, in the common interest. So I'm always interested, what is the common interest? Which they, in theory, represent and try to defend.
That's nicely put. I will ask one last question because the conversation is going well and we're producing quite a bit of jokes, so no pressure. But when you say that we need to be rethinking rules and regulations, and it is important, I was thinking, you mentioned COVID, which is one of the issues we've got today. We've got another really big issue. We've got, for example, in our country, right near us, the war going on, and you know the threat of a war everywhere. Why would we bother rethinking rules and regulations of how cities work when we have these life-threatening situations?
Well, I mean, just like COVID, which was life-threatening in a health way rather than a war way, many, many places completely rethought how they operate. They had to respond more quickly. They had to say, we can't do it in the old way because people are dying. We better do something immediately. They got resources. They found new ways of partnership with NGOs and privates to solve, I don't know, a delivery problem or whatever the problem was. In terms of the war, you know, when you're this close, you know, I can't say trivial things, but clearly it's about being responsive in one way or another and knowing that you've got to be strategically principled, which you are. You know you can't go back to the 40s, having heard whatever I heard about Lithuania in the 40s. And the threat is, of course, that could return. So I can't answer in a good way.
Yeah, but let's dwell on this a little because we'll have 2 still discussions with you participating in them. So plenty of opportunities to discuss those and different aspects. For now, I will want to thank you very much for your presentation and again, your glorious enthusiasm with which you were on stage. Thank you so much. That was Charles Landry.
Thank you.